One of my fans actually went to a Vivek Ramaswamy event and apparently confronted him on Ukraine. So let's go check out this video. Let's go check out this confrontation to Vivek Ramaswamy. Oh, and before we get started, I just want to say I'm not a huge fan of Ramaswamy. I think he wants to run the country like a fledgling tech startup. You know, talking about mass layoffs of 75% of the country's, civil servants. Talking about, oh, I don't know, let's do these crazy ideas of having it so 18 to 25-year-olds have to do a poll test to test their civic duty. But he just seems to be targeting a demographic that votes against his voting bloc. Then, of course, when it comes to the actual issue of Ukraine, which he's about to be challenged on here, he's lied multiple times. I think the clearest example about him lying about Ukraine, and the thing that I think is probably the silliest, is when he said that Javelin missiles that we were sending to Ukraine were actually being sold to the cartels. And he posted an article which, when checked, just showed a picture of a Swedish provided munition being used by the cartels, a Swedish weapon, not an American one.
Layla Spellwind gave Kiwiteapae a tier 1 subscription.
Hey, thank you.
I won't be here very often, because I'm not big on live streams rather than YouTube videos. But I still want to support. Have a gift subscription.
Thank you so much for the gifted tier 1 sub. I appreciate it. But outside of just silly mistakes like that Ramaswamy has made, he also is kind of looking at the whole war from a very strange angle from all of his opponents. He has recently proposed a new idea. Well, it's not really a new idea, but it's new for him, which is not only should we freeze the line of conflict and let Russia keep everything it's grabbed illegally, but we should try to make an alliance with Russia against China, which would most certainly mean not only giving them what they currently have in Ukraine and allowing them to hold it, but probably more, even outside of Ukraine, when it comes to things like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, removing our protection for those countries, maybe reversing Finnish membership of NATO, which they're going to try to use as an umbrella to protect themselves, removing the nuclear umbrella of protection for Eastern European states, or maybe any post-Soviet state. Either way, all I'm trying to get across is that Vivek Ramaswamy has a very strange position on Ukraine, and I'm very interested to see what the question is. And I haven't pre-watched this, so this is going to be my first watching.
Yeah, hi, I'm Josh, I'm from Massachusetts, and yeah, I get you want to make a deal with Putin, but I was wondering, I don't know, there's been a lot of things in the past where kind of Russia has kind of not really honored their agreements. Like in 1994 when Ukraine agreed to give up their nukes in exchange for territorial sovereignty, and when Putin a long time ago he said he wouldn't invade Ukraine. And then there was the Minsk 1 and 2 agreements. In Minsk 2 agreements, Russia said that they would hold elections, they would withdraw their heavy equipment. They didn't, and they kept shelling the Ukrainian side. So I was wondering, why do you think that Putin would they would honor any of those agreements?
Yeah, it's a good question. So
the premise of the question is, and he gives a few examples. The Budapest memorandum is the first example he gives. Then he gives an example of, he gives a different example. But his point basically is, why do you think Russia would respect any of the agreements that you're trying to make with them on Ukraine, considering the fact that they haven't done this in the past? He brings up the Budapest memorandum, which was an agreement between the United States, Ukraine, and Russia, which was about Ukraine giving up its nuclear arsenal in return for territorial guarantees, which Russia continued to reassert all the way up until the invasion of 2014. Even in 2008, after the invasion of Georgia, Vladimir Putin said there was no ethnic issue in Crimea, which either was masking his true position or he magically changed his position on in the 6 years following. So he is basically asking Vivek Ramaswamy, how are you going to make this deal with the Russians, considering how untrustworthy they are?
At the risk of getting into a lot of detail here that may take us down a rabbit hole, these are some of the most important questions the next commander-in-chief is going to have to contend with. So let's talk about Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. I think we have been more offside on Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 than Vladimir Putin has. In fact, Angela Merkel disastrously in late 2021 said, Minsk was really just about, her words not mine, biding our time. And we've been arming Ukraine to the teeth in the meantime. We talk about the 1994 Budapest memorandum.
The thing that gets me about the Minsk I and Minsk II Accord and what Angela Merkel said about it is Angela Merkel is viewed very negatively when it comes to the topic of Ukraine and the topic of Russia. Not only in Europe proper, but many Germans are starting to reassess her view on Russia and continuing to trade with Russia and becoming so, not just continuing to trade with Russia, but becoming so reliant on Russian energy exports. And she tried to justify this by saying that integration with Russia maybe could act as a democratizing force or would stop Russia from doing something like this. And obviously that was not the case. And so after the fact, Angela Merkel said post-invasion that it was actually a delaying tactic to help the Ukrainians prepare. Now, she might be telling the truth, or she might be completely full of shit and trying to correct the record after the fact, or change what actually the intention of Minsk I and Minsk II was after the fact in order to make herself look better. I just don't know why we're so quick to accept Angela Merkel on her word about what the real intentions of Minsk I and Minsk II was after the fact, after her image on the issue of Ukraine had been solidly dragged through the mud. I don't know why Vivek Ramaswamy would so quickly trust Angela Merkel on that. That's the first thing. The second thing is, let me hear what he said. I think he's saying that we armed them to the teeth.
Minsk was really just about, her words not mine, biding our time. And we've been arming Ukraine to the teeth in the meantime.
We were not arming Ukraine to the teeth in the meantime. We were very barely arming Ukraine with anything. In fact, until 2019, well after Minsk I and Minsk II, which we're talking 2015, so that's 4 years after the fact, was when we actually agreed to give Ukraine what would be considered offensive weapons. And when we say offensive weapons, I don't mean weapons to go invade Russia. I mean things that shoot, right? Where before we would maybe give them, I know the Obama administration gave them counter battery radar. This was actually weapons that could shoot and blow up a Russian tank that was invading Ukraine. Like, for example, the Javelins. Now, that aid was held up by Donald Trump in order to try to extort Zelensky and the Ukrainian government for information on Donald Trump's political opponents, namely Hunter Biden and Joe Biden. But that was the first time we actually sent over lethal aid. And it was not a tremendous amount of lethal aid. I think leading into the invasion, I think in total, we ended up sending around, I think this might even be in total for all the allies, like over $1 billion, I think. And that's like in total. Now you compare that to afterwards, it's like, I don't know, 3 to 5% of what we ended up sending Ukraine at the end of the day. Like all of the allies started sending Ukraine. It's a very small percentage overall. Definitely when you consider the size of the force that was invading. A lot of shoulder-mounted munitions. Not, for example, like the HIMARS or the M113 troop carriers or the Bradleys or the Abrams or any of the Storm Shadow missiles. It was very, we didn't give them such extensive weapons. We didn't give them the air defense, like the Patriot air defense systems. A lot smaller shipments. And now I think that was in large part due to the fact that we were scared that if the Russians invaded Ukraine, they would take over the whole country, they wouldn't fight, and then they would just capture all this expensive American equipment, so we just gave them things like shoulder-mounted munitions instead. But we didn't really arm them to the teeth. That is a mischaracterization.
You talk about the 1994 Budapest memorandum. First of all, it's not a treaty, but we have more than fulfilled our obligations to that Budapest memorandum. It's 2 pages long. Just take a look. It's non-explicit commitments that will generally recognize the border of Ukraine.
I don't know why it being 2 pages long would mean anything, but...
Right. I'm sorry, spending 10 times more than their annual GDP on just their defense, the United States supplying that. That's pretty darn close to more than fulfilling our obligations of the Budapest memorandum. When nobody's talking about James Baker's 1990 not 1 inch commitment not to move Ukraine 1 inch past.
So I don't know what he means by we spend more than their annual GDP. I just looked up their gross domestic product. It's 200 billion. As far as I know, we've sent about 40 billion in military aid. So that would be about 25%, if we're being generous and overshooting it, of their GDP. So I don't know where he gets. He says their annual GDP. I can see if there's a different number that I'm missing that it says it's only like 20 billion or 30 billion. I can't find anything. Maybe there's something else that I just missed, but I don't think that's correct.
Germany.
Also, and let me just say, when he says we've more than fulfilled it, it depends. Again, it depends on your interpretation of it. My argument would be the nature of the agreement was we will respect and help Ukraine maintain its territorial integrity in response for them giving up their nuclear arsenal, because a nuclear arsenal is basically a permanent guarantee of your territorial integrity, because no one's going to invade you. And since they gave that up in pursuance of denuclearization at the end of the Cold War, because we wanted to de-escalate, the arms race, and a lot of post-Soviet states with gigantic nuclear arsenals was very scary because we didn't know how those governments were going to pan out. And more actors with the big red button means more opportunities for failure on a scary scale. So they agreed to give up a great tool to defend their nuclear sovereignty in exchange for not having to pay for it, which is a big motivator that isn't talked about often, but that was a big motivator, and in exchange for territorial guarantees from the West and Russia. Now, let's say that we basically say, you know what? When we said we would help you maintain your territorial integrity, we just meant like we would give you some assistance, but we would not actually see through you defending your territorial integrity. And so we're going to drop you. And not only are we going to drop you, this is Vivek Ramaswamy's plan. We're going to give the Russians what they want in order for us to turn them against the Chinese, which probably means the abandonment of Ukraine, which would almost certainly mean the complete abandonment of Ukraine if you were to try to get the Russians to agree to such an ambitious plan. Probably wouldn't only have to abandon Ukraine, you'd probably have to abandon a few other countries like Moldova, maybe some Baltic states. You'd have to probably see a complete European realignment, or at least get the Americans to agree to a complete European realignment. That would bring a lot of country sovereignty into question. But my point is, if the world gets the message, you give up your nuclear weapons, your sovereignty is dead, your country will be trampled upon, no matter how powerful the nation states are that agreed to help you protect your sovereignty. If you give up your nuclear weapons, you'll always regret it. And hell, Zelensky was getting that message. That is the message that was being sent leading in to the invasion. Because when Zelensky went to a conference a few months before the Russian invasion, he was talking about the fact that, look, we gave up our nuclear arsenal. And what did the West provide us? What did the West help us? Who assisted Ukraine after we gave up a nuclear arsenal? Maybe if the West and Russia isn't upholding its side of the bargain when it comes to our territorial integrity, maybe we should uphold our end of the bargain when it comes to not having nuclear weapons. The Russians then used this to fearmonger, but the point was solid.
And yet NATO has expanded far more after the fall of the USSR than it ever did during the existence of the USSR, when NATO's purpose was supposedly to contain the USSR in the first place. And so that's a long way of saying.
Why do they want to join NATO, though?
What's that?
Why do you think those countries would want to join NATO?
They want to join NATO because they like to free ride on the United States of America. Who doesn't? Everybody loves to free ride from Uncle Sam.
Okay, I think Vivek Ramaswamy is being purposefully facetious and dodging the obvious answer to this. They want to join NATO because they're scared of being invaded. The reason you join a military defensive pact is because you're scared of being invaded. So his answer to why Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania would want to join NATO after seeing, Chechnya get invaded and knowing the history of Russia, their answer was, oh, we just want a free ride. That's Vivek Ramaswamy's framing of it. It couldn't be without NATO membership. That justification that Russia used to invade Ukraine would also mean trampling on Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. It would also probably mean trampling on other post-Soviet states. Vladimir Putin has certainly already laid out his justification for it. This is just like populist framing. I think the guy was trying to get at, like, hey, you're saying NATO expansion, oh, it's so aggressive and mean to Russia. But the reason NATO was expanding was because these countries wanted to join NATO because they were afraid of a Russian invasion, which Ukraine has become victim to, which Chechnya was victim to, which Georgia was victim to. And Ukraine's been victim to it twice. And instead he's like, well, actually, it's because they're all cheap. Are we really going to say that Poland is cheap? Poland, have we seen their increases in military spending recently? As a percentage of GDP, Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia have contributed more to Ukraine's defense than the United States. Poland is greatly increasing its military spending, not as just a total percentage of its GDP, but because of its economic growth on top of that, it's growing on multiple levels, and it's increasing its defense procurement. So, I don't think it's that simple. It is true that these nation states are safer when allied with the United States because of our power, but saying that it's a free ride when the Poles are providing hundreds upon hundreds of tanks to Ukraine, vastly increasing military spending, going past the 2% threshold. I think they actually spend a higher percentage of their overall GDP on military spending than even we do now. So, yeah, no, I think this is dodging what the question was trying to get at for just populist rhetoric.
But Uncle Sam was turned into Uncle Sucker, okay? And I don't want Uncle Sam to be Uncle Sucker. I want Uncle Sam to stand for the interests of our citizens. I mean, let's just talk. You're dragging me into the rabbit hole, which I love. But it's dragging me. I'll get into the details, right? More than half of NATO countries don't even meet their NATO level commitment for a percentage of GDP spent on U.S. military spending.
What's interesting about this, though, is if the closer you get to Russia, the more the spending increases. It has increased and contributed in contributions to the war in Ukraine has increased. So the answer would be, when Vivek Ramaswamy brings this up, isn't to abandon the countries that are trying to contribute the most to the defense of Ukraine and are the ones increasing their own defense spending the most, like in the case of Poland, and are going to contribute the most to NATO's defense down the road. Poland, definitely, when you look at how fast its economy is growing and how it's becoming a real powerhouse in Europe. His solution isn't to try to get the French to spend more or work with the Germans to try to advance their military spending so they spend more as a percentage, which it was also part of Donald Trump's tactic. His position is, well, let's just realign with the Russians so we don't have to worry about it, period, and we can just concentrate on the Chinese. Which, I just want to say, how are you going to get the Europeans to agree to do anything, to put any pressure on the Chinese, if you won't agree also to help protect them? What's in it for them? Definitely as many of them, like the Germans and other economies in Europe, are entering a recession.
More than half of them don't even spend 2% a year on GDP. So we're paying, and by the way, Europe actually has the capability. I mean, Germany, these guys, oh man. Olaf Scholz, you get Angela Merkel, they know how to play the United States like a fiddle, all right? The Pied Pipers of Hamelin come in pairs. Zelensky and Germany, they're really two sides of the same coin.
Germany has increased its defense spending in the last year. I know that Olaf Scholz did a really big speech where he justified this increase in military spending, where he was talking about tens upon tens of billions of dollars increase in military spending. We haven't seen that really have an impact on the Bundeswehr on the ground yet. A lot of it is still going through the bureaucratic processes. I know Pirun did a very good video talking about NATO military spending recently. I'm really happy. I actually watched that video today. I'm really happy this came up because I watched that video today. I would go recommend that video for anybody who wanted a more in-depth look at NATO procurement going into 2023. I mean, going out of 2023.
The real problem is we're being played, right? We have this machismo that we sort of picked up at the end of the Cold War, but the Cold War realists, like George Kennan, who actually was the chief architect of our Cold War deterrence strategy, he died in the late 1990s. Before he died, he was the one who said that NATO expansion was the number one mistake that we made in our Cold War deterrence policy. Too bad the guy's now long dead. He's the kind of person we actually need. I mean, when I'm looking for my...
Okay, but can he explain why it was a mistake? I just want to... This is the thing. What I really don't like about political figures and political stump speeches and just like politicians in general, and this isn't just something the politicians do, I see commentators do it too, is when somebody cites an expert and just says, this expert thinks this, and then just kind of like looks around. It's like, yeah, but they're bringing up an expert who thinks one thing on an extremely contentious, divisive issue. For his canon, I could cite somebody else. I could cite a different person who disagrees with him. Is there a specific track record we should look for from Kennan to be like, this is a guy who was right. He was right during the Cold War, so we should listen to his advice over the advice of other people. Here's why his case is more, assertive or better.
Secretary of State, and I'm already looking. We got
Not to mention, it seems that his whole framing for this war is just NATO. It seems to be his reason for why the war is happening. Which I think is a simplistic analysis, considering that Ukraine had no chance of joining NATO in 2022 when the Russians invaded, meaning there had to be other reasons.
Anybody want to chat afterwards? We're staffing our federal government already, but it's hard, actually. You've got to have a liberal hegemony model of foreign policy with neocons effectively staffing both parties. I'm going to be on that debate stage next week. On the issue of Ukraine, it's not that different. If you're Joe Biden, Liz Cheney, or somebody in between, traditional guy in the Republican Party, half that stage, if not more of it's going to be on the same side of this question. And so I think that's part of the reason why we have repeatedly failed over and over again, because we failed to define the purpose of our military or our foreign policy. So I favor a modern Monroe Doctrine. What does that mean? You don't mess with the United States on our own soil or in the Western Hemisphere. Chinese spy balloon, not okay with it. Chinese spy base in Cuba, not okay with it. Chinese-made fentanyl coming across with Mexican drug cartels across our southern border, killing 50 times the number of people this year of fentanyl poison.
Was Vivek Ramaswamy one of the people who proposed a military intervention in Mexico? I don't remember. It seemed like every single Republican in the primary was like, I don't even care if the Mexican government agrees. We're just going to put troops down there and we'll see what they do. We're going to drone strike them. Was he one of them? I forget. I know there was multiple on the campaign trail that said it. I believe he might have been one of them.
Of the number who died on 9/11, not okay with it.
Farmland.
He condemns 9/11.
Chinese ownership of farmland, turning our children into a bunch, or grandchildren, into a bunch of Chinese serfs. I'm not okay with it. Chinese control of the Panama Canal. I'm not okay with it. If you don't hear, releasing man-made viruses from a bioterrorism lab in Wuhan.
He doesn't know that. Okay, whatever. Well, he had to put that at the end so he can get the you truth teller. You say the things that aren't verified. Woo! Truth teller.
That shuts us down for an extended period of time and kills hundreds of thousands of Americans. I'm not okay with it. You have hell to pay for it if you mess with the United States on our own home turf. But that has to be the priority, rather than fighting somebody else's war in God knows where for what reason we can only guess.
For what reason we can only guess. There's many reasons. There's been many reasons given. He's just plain stupid. Well, I don't think he's plain stupid. But number one, we're doing it because we made a commitment. And I think the United States word should mean something. And after Afghanistan, and after Yemen, and after Iraq, and after pulling out of the Iran deal, and after flip-flopping on Syria and a million different issues, America's word does not look very powerful right now. In fact, I would say America's word is almost not worth what it's written on. It's not worth the paper it's written on. And so if there's anything I think we should not prioritize, it's backstabbing another ally at the 19th hour as they're in sight of pulling off the impossible, right? That's the first thing. I also think that Euro-Atlantic stability is the basis of modern American economic prosperity, and expanding that is a good thing. I also believe, and I know this is a crazy thing to say, the international rule of law. Us sending the weapons to Ukraine is absolutely legal because it is in line with the nation state's right to self-defense and self-determination and sovereignty. It's completely legal, in line with international law, and it is not viewed negatively by the international community. It doesn't give us any heat at all, but it gives us a long-term ally, an ally that I think is going to be very helpful for us economically. It has a burgeoning tech sector, has plenty of resources that they could trade with us, is going to be mutually beneficial for both of our country as we try to help with rebuilding and we try to build a decent economic relationship with them. They're going to be, and I mean, I don't want to like be like, woohoo, military industrial complex, but anybody working in a factory producing weapons in the United States is going to have a customer in Ukraine for a very long time. If you're trying to think of a very self-interested kind of just like America, what's in America's own self-interest, if that's the only framing you care about. Not to mention the fact that I think it's good to have allies that ideologically are aligned with us. It's pretty awkward when we open up the newspaper and find our allies, like in Saudi Arabia, chopping up journalists and embassies. Doesn't make us look good. Doesn't make us feel good. And we feel pretty scummy about where our money's going to. Here's a question towards Vivek Ramaswamy, if he's really committed to this. Is he going to commit to no more aid to Israel? If his thing is just Western Hemisphere, then I want to hear Vivek Ramaswamy commit that he will not send one more penny of aid to Israel if that's his commitment. And he doesn't want to support God knows what, God knows where. I have a weird feeling he's not going to make that commitment. In fact, does anybody know his position on Israel? Has he ever stated his position on Israel? And also, all of this is besides the obvious humanitarian implications. Israel. Oh my gosh, he actually wants to cut off aid to Israel? Wow. Told Fox Digital, we wish her well in the future of corporate America. Really, he does. He wants to end our special bond with his. Oh my goodness, he really does. Well, look at that. So he really just wants to pull back to our foreign policy of like 1920. He wants to like he wants to go back to Woodrow Wilson-esque. You know, we rule the Western Hemisphere. This is our empire. The Russians rule half of Europe. Maybe allow the European Union to rule whatever they can keep out of the clutches of the Russian advance. And we also rule Asia, though? That's a question. If Vivek Ramaswamy is just like Western Hemisphere, why Taiwan? Is it just the chip manufacturing? Then here's a question. Once we produce enough chip manufacturing in the United States, do we abandon Taiwan? Say, not our business anymore? Why the competition with China if you're concentrating on the Western Hemisphere?
It comes back down to that for Ukraine. That's really the choice and the reorientation we face in our foreign policy. And the last thing I'll say on this, you really got me going on this. So thank you. I appreciate it. What's your name?
Josh, yeah, I just want.
How old are you?
I'm 23. I just want to say that 1990 that like wasn't in like an official treaty. James Baker said.
And neither was the Ukraine 1994 Budapest memorandum, right? Okay. And so I like that you really educated.
Wait, what is he talking about? There's nothing written down in treaty or in agreement as far as I'm aware to stop NATO expansion. There is a public agreement signed by both the governments of the United States, Ukraine, and Russia recognizing Ukraine's territorial integrity, something that Putin was reasserting as late as 2008 after the invasion of Georgia. So I do think we're talking about a little different in precedence here. Something different in precedent. There we go.
About this, you're making better arguments to me than I get to like CNN or MSNBC. So thank you for that. I'm saying like a beer in the headlines.
If he's you know what? You want to know how I know he's making a decent enough argument? Because Ramaswamy's also not confronting these arguments head on. For example, that one point he made about when he said NATO is expanding, and the kid said, "Why was NATO expanding? Why did those countries want NATO?" And there is a difficult question, because then you would have to confront what Russia did in Chechnya. Then you would have to confront why these states would have an interest in joining NATO, that it wasn't this evil like expansion that America just forced on all these countries, but they actually came to NATO and asked for them joining. And instead of answering, well, you know, actually it's because they were afraid of Russian invasion, which ended up happening, he just said, oh, they want a free ride, right? That's how I know he asked a decent question, is because he kind of dodged that. He dodged it for populism.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you guys training me for the debate, she said. I like that. But like, honest to God, you're like 23 years old. You're asking me better questions than like half the news media who probably had no idea who James Baker was. So thank you for this. But I think the deeper point is we have to revive realism in our foreign policy.
By God, please let it die.
It is okay for me to tell you the same thing that I will tell other world leaders, which is that as the U.S. president, I will stand exclusively for American interests. That is actually something we can be proud of. But other countries can trust us more if we do. Because if we're lying about it, if we're lying about saying, no, it's just about defending democracy, sometimes when we feel like it, even when it's not actually a democracy, it's a guy who persecutes churches in his own country.
And there it is. He persecutes churches in his own country. I want to ask Vivek Ramaswamy. I just want to hear him say that if somebody said after 9/11 in the United States that somebody would go to heaven if they came to America and killed Americans, that in that scenario, the FBI wouldn't kick down the door whoever led that organization. I just want to hear that. I just want to hear that from Vivek Ramaswamy, right? And by the way, it is a democracy. See, this is the problem, man. He can't stick to the point. He can't stick to the reality of it. He has to go off script. He needs to start writing fan fiction. Because if he doesn't start writing fan fiction about it not being a democracy, it doesn't look good that he wants to pull the rug out from under them. Because if he says, yes, abandon the democracy, fuck the Ukrainians, let the Russians conquer them. And in his plan, if he wants the Russians to turn on China, he's going to have to just give them all of Ukraine, period. He's going to have to do some grand gambit to change the Russians' mind. He's going to have to do something, right? If he says that they're a democracy and he has to acknowledge that, it's going to look a lot worse when he abandons them.
And eliminates opposition parties, but we'll call it democracy. But if it's democracy somewhere else, some nation in Africa, who cares? Like, it's just not credible. Versus being realistic and honest, that we stand for our own interests. Our obligation to the rest of the world, you know what it is? It is to be strong here at home and set an example of what is possible for the rest of the free world. Because think about it. If America's weak, if we're no longer that shining city on a hill, what hope does the rest of the world have? So I think it is not only our prosperous choice to...
I just want to remember you guys, I just want to remind you guys, we spent 0.3% of our GDP on sending aid to Ukraine. Maybe 0.4 now. Maybe it's changed by 0.1%. That's what we're talking about. When we talk about like all of this like crazy spending in budget, man, we never talk about the Trump tax cuts. We never talk about subsidies to oil and gas companies. We never talk about any of that. It's always the aid to Ukraine. Always the aid to Ukraine.
Embrace American interests. It is the morally correct choice for us to stand for what is best for the United States of America, because that is what is also best for the free world as we know it.
It's best for the free world for us to stop sending weapons to Ukraine and ally with the Russians. Fantastic. Vivek Ramaswamy, intellectual powerhouse.